The metallic taste of war hung heavy in the Pacific air as Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr. paced the bridge of his flagship, the USS New Jersey. It was October 20th, 1944, and the largest naval armada in history was converging on a small cluster of islands that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to begin, though none of the men preparing for combat could fully comprehend the magnitude of what lay ahead. General Douglas MacArthur had made his promise to return to the Philippines, and now that promise was being kept with unprecedented force. The American invasion fleet stretched beyond the horizon, over 700 vessels, carrying 107 to 4,000 troops toward the beaches of Leyte. But the Japanese Empire, desperate and cornered, had prepared their own devastating response. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, the most powerful component of the Japanese fleet. His massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, each displacing over 70,000 tons and armed with 18-inch guns, represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. These steel leviathans, accompanied by heavy cruisers and destroyers, formed the spearhead of Operation Shogo I, Japan's last desperate gambit to destroy the American invasion fleet. The Japanese plan was audacious in its complexity and desperation, for separate forces would converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously, creating a devastating pincer movement that would catch the Americans between hammer and anvil. Admiral Jisaburo Izawa's northern force, built around the remaining aircraft carriers Zuikaku and Zuiho, would serve as bait to lure Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the landing beaches. Meanwhile, Kurita's center force would smash through San Bernardino Strait, and Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force would navigate the treacherous Surigao Strait. As dawn broke over the Philippine Sea, radar operators aboard American vessels began detecting massive formations approaching from multiple directions. The scope screens painted an ominous picture, hundreds of blips, representing the largest concentration of naval power ever assembled in a single battle. What was about to unfold would dwarf even the great clashes of Midway and the Philippine Sea. According to historical records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, over 230 vessels from both sides would participate in this titanic struggle, making it not only the largest naval battle of World War II, but the largest in human history. The stakes could not have been higher. Control of the Philippines meant control of Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia and oil resources. That kept their war machine functioning. Captain Ernest Edwin Evans of the USS Johnston understood the gravity of the situation as he watched his destroyer take position alongside other vessels of Taffy 3. These small escort carriers and destroyers, designated as Task Unit 7 to 7.4.3, were never intended to face battleships in direct combat. Yet circumstances would soon demand exactly that sacrifice from these brave men. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steel decks as ammunition was loaded. Guns were trained and final preparations were made. Radio chatter filled the airwaves with position reports, weather updates, and the calm, professional voices of men preparing for battle. None of them knew that they were about to participate in four separate engagements that would collectively become known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a confrontation that would rage for 4 days and nights across thousands of square miles of ocean, forever changing the course of the Pacific. War and the fate of nations. The morning of October 24th brought clear skies and calm seas to the Sabayan Sea, conditions that would prove both blessing and curse for Admiral Kurita's center force. As his 23 warships steamed eastward through the narrow waters between Mindoro and Luzon, American reconnaissance aircraft circling high overhead transmitted coordinates that would soon rain death from the sky. Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitchell's Task Force 38 had been waiting for exactly this moment. From the flight decks of the USS Intrepid, USS Cabot, USS Independence, and USS Langley, wave after wave of Grumman Hellcat fighters and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers launched into the tropical morning air. The largest carrier-based air assault in naval history was about to commence. The first strike found Kurita's force at 8:30 in the morning. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from the USS Essex, spotted the massive silhouettes of Japanese battleships cutting through the azure waters. The sight that greeted the American pilots was both magnificent and terrifying. The super battleship Musashi, her pagoda-style superstructure rising like a steel mountain from the sea, flanked by her sister ship Yamato and a screen of heavy cruisers. Kurita had anticipated air attacks, but the ferocity and coordination of the American assault exceeded his worst fears. The first wave of Helldivers screamed down through the anti-aircraft fire, their 1,000-pound bombs aimed at the most heavily armored ships ever built. The Musashi, designed to be unsinkable, began taking hit after devastating hit. Her massive 18-inch guns, capable of hurling shells weighing as much as automobiles, were powerless against the tiny aircraft that swarmed around her like angry hornets. By 10:30, a second wave of American aircraft arrived. This time, torpedo bombers joined the assault, their deadly fish aimed at the waterlines of the Japanese giants. The heavy cruiser Myoko took multiple torpedo hits and was forced to retire, her hull torn open and flooding. But it was the Musashi that bore the brunt of the American fury. Hit after hit pounded into her armored hull, each explosion sending geysers of smoke and flame into the sky. The crew of the Musashi fought with desperate courage as their ship slowly died beneath them. Damage control parties worked frantically to shore up bulkheads and pump out flooded compartments, but the scale of destruction was overwhelming. Captain Toshihira Inoguchi refused repeated suggestions to abandon ship, declaring that he would share the fate of his vessel. A third wave arrived at 1:15 in the afternoon, then a fourth at 3:30. The concentrated firepower of hundreds of aircraft was gradually overwhelming even the Musashi's legendary armor. Her massive bulk began to list to port as thousands of tons of seawater poured through her ruptured hull. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as her ammunition magazines cooked off, sending pillars of fire hundreds of feet into the air. Meanwhile, the smaller ships of Kurita's force suffered their own agony. The heavy cruiser Haguro limped away with her superstructure in ruins, her radio antennas severed and her forward turrets silent. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this aerial massacre was Kurita's decision to continue eastward despite the devastating losses. Even as the Musashi's death throes played out behind him, the Japanese admiral pressed forward with grim determination. His remaining ships, led by the still mighty Yamato, maintained course for San Bernardino Strait and the vulnerable American transports beyond. As the sun set over the Sibian Sea on October 24th, the Musashi finally succumbed to her wounds. The great ship rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves at 7:30-5 in the evening, taking over half her crew of 2,400 men with her. It was the first time in naval history that aircraft alone had sunk a battleship of her size and power, marking the definitive end of the battleship era and the complete ascendancy of carrier aviation. In naval warfare, as darkness fell over Leyte Gulf on October 24, 1944, Rear Admiral Jesse Bartlett Oldendorf prepared for what would become the last great battleship engagement in naval history. His Task Force 7-7.2 controlled the narrow waters of Surigao Strait, and intelligence reports confirmed that Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force was approaching from the south with deadly intent. Oldendorf's force represented the resurrection of American naval power. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, 6 battleships formed the backbone of his fleet: the USS West Virginia, USS Tennessee, USS California, USS Maryland, USS Pennsylvania, and USS Mississippi. 5 of these mighty vessels had been present during the surprise attack on December 7, 1941, and their crews burned with a desire for revenge that had been 3 years in the making. The tactical situation was a naval commander's dream. Surigao Strait was only 25 miles long and 15 miles wide at its narrowest point, creating a natural bottleneck that would force the Japanese ships into a predetermined killing zone. Oldendorf arranged his forces in a classic crossing the T formation, with his battleships positioned perpendicular to the Japanese line of advance. This would allow every American gun to bear on the enemy while limiting the Japanese to only their forward weapons. At 11:36 in the evening, the first contact was made. PT boats stationed at the southern entrance to the strait reported multiple large contacts approaching at high speed. Lieutenant Commander Robert Leeson's PT 493 fired the first shots of what would become the Battle of Surigao Strait. His torpedoes aimed at the battleship Fuso as she led Nishimura's column northward. The Japanese force consisted of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and for destroyers a powerful formation under normal circumstances, but woefully inadequate for what lay ahead. The battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, veterans of the Great War era, carried 14-inch guns that had been formidable in their day, but were now outmatched by the more modern American vessels waiting in the darkness ahead. As Nishimura's ships advanced through the strait, they ran a gauntlet of torpedo attacks that began systematically dismantling his formation. First, the PT boats struck from the shadows, their Mark 13 torpedoes finding targets among the screening destroyers. Then Commander Jesse Coward's Destroyer Squadron 54 launched a coordinated attack that sent multiple fish racing toward the Japanese battleships. At 2:58 in the morning of October 25th, The Fuso took to torpedo hits that broke her back and set her ablaze from stem to stern. The great ship broke into her forward section, continuing northward like a ghost ship, while her stern section burned and sank. The sight was so spectacular that American radar operators initially reported to separate contacts, not realizing they were observing the death throes of a single battleship. But it was at 3:51 in the morning that the true thunder began. Admiral Oldendorf's battleships opened fire simultaneously, their massive guns illuminating the night with muzzle flashes that could be seen for miles. The USS West Virginia, her modern radar fire control system providing pinpoint accuracy, fired the first salvo. 14 shells, each weighing 1,600 pounds, arced through the darkness toward the approaching Yamashiro. The Japanese battleship found herself facing 6 opponents, their combined firepower overwhelming her ancient armor and obsolete fire control systems. Shell after shell crashed into her superstructure, turning her upper works into a blazing inferno. Her pagoda-style conning tower, once a symbol of Japanese naval pride, collapsed in a shower of twisted steel and flame. Admiral Nishimura, realizing the hopelessness of his situation, ordered his remaining ships to continue the attack. The heavy cruiser Mogami and 3 destroyers pressed forward through the hellish barrage, their crews displaying courage that bordered on the suicidal. But courage alone could not overcome the mathematics of firepower. One by one, the Japanese ships were overwhelmed and destroyed. By dawn on October 25th, the Battle of Surigao Strait was over. Of Nishimura's 7 ships, only the damaged cruiser Mogami escaped, as she would be sunk by aircraft later that morning. The admiral himself went down with his flagship Yamashiro, joining nearly 4,000 Japanese sailors who perished in the 30-minute engagement. American casualties were minimal: 39 men killed and 114 wounded, most from a friendly fire incident. The last battleship versus battleship action in naval history had ended in complete American victory, clearing the southern approach to Leyte Gulf and removing one entire Japanese force from the Iwo Jima. Dawn on October 25, 1944, revealed the most improbable David versus Goliath confrontation in naval history. Off the coast of Samar Island, Rear Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague's task unit 7-7 point for point 3 calls signed Taffy 3 suddenly found itself face-to-face with Admiral Kurita's center force emerging from San Bernardino, straight like steel phantoms from a nightmare. Sprague commanded 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escort vessels designed for anti-submarine warfare and ground support, not fleet engagement. His biggest guns were 5 inches mounted on his destroyers. Facing him were 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, led by the mighty Yamato, with her 18-inch rifles capable of hurling shells over 25 miles. The odds were so overwhelming that Kurita's gunnery officer initially mistook the small American carriers for fleet carriers, reporting to his admiral that they had encountered House's main force. This misidentification would prove crucial to the battle's outcome, as Kurita began maneuvering his heavy ships as if he were facing equals, rather than the maritime equivalent of fishing boats. At 6:58 in the morning, the Japanese opened fire. The first salvo from the heavy cruiser Kumano sent towering waterspouts cascading over the escort carrier USS White Plains. Sprague immediately ordered his ships to make smoke and flee eastward at maximum speed, but his escort carriers could barely make 18 knots, less than half the speed of the pursuing Japanese cruisers. What followed was the most desperate and heroic action in United States Navy history. Captain Ernest Edwin Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston made a decision that would echo through the ages. Instead of fleeing with the carriers, he turned his ship directly toward the advancing Japanese fleet and charged into the teeth of their overwhelming firepower. "Commence firing," Evans shouted over the ship's intercom. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The Johnston's 5-inch guns began barking defiance at ships 10 times her size. Her torpedoes raced through the water toward the heavy cruiser Kumano, scoring hits that would eventually force the Japanese ship to retire. But Evans's gallant charge came at a terrible cost. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, joined the suicidal charge. Commander Robert Witherspoon Copeland ordered his men to load their single 5-inch gun with armor-piercing rounds and engage the Japanese battleships at point-blank range. For over an hour, the tiny ship traded shots with giants, her crew displaying courage that bordered on the supernatural. Meanwhile, the escort carrier pilots launched every available aircraft, regardless of armament. Fighters loaded with anti-personnel bombs dove on Japanese battleships, while torpedo bombers armed with depth charges pressed home attacks against cruisers. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable led a group of Wildcat fighters in repeated strafing runs against the bridge of the heavy cruiser Chikai, his machine gun bullets somehow managing to damage the ship's communication systems and disrupt her fire control. The destroyer USS Hull, commanded by Commander Leon Robert Kentberger, made her own death ride toward the Japanese fleet, hit repeatedly by large-caliber shells, her superstructure ablaze and her forward magazines flooding. The Hull continued fighting until her main battery was silenced and her hull split open. She rolled over and sank at 9:10 in the morning, taking over 100 of her crew with her. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this impossible battle was its psychological effect on Admiral Kurita. The ferocity of the American resistance, combined with the confusion created by smokescreens and air attacks, convinced him that he was facing a much larger force than intelligence had indicated. The sight of destroyers charging directly at his battleships and actions so contrary to naval logic that it bordered on insanity suggested to the Japanese admiral that this was merely the vanguard of Halsey's entire Third Fleet. As the morning wore on, Kurita's doubts multiplied. His ships were suffering damage from the persistent air attacks. His formation was scattered by the destroyer charges, and radio reports suggested that American reinforcements were approaching from multiple directions. At 11:15, with victory seemingly within his grasp and the helpless American transports just hours away, Kurita made the most controversial decision of his career. He ordered his surviving ships to withdraw, turning away from Leyte Gulf just as the greatest naval prize in Pacific War history lay defenseless before him. The battle off Samar was over, but its cost had been enormous. The Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts were lost, along with the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay. Over 1,000 American sailors had died in the hopeless fight, but their sacrifice had saved MacArthur's invasion fleet and preserved American control of Leyte Gulf. While the drama off Samar unfolded in deadly earnest, Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr. found himself chasing shadows across the northern Philippine Sea. The previous evening, reconnaissance aircraft had reported Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's northern force approaching from the northeast, and Halsey had taken the bait exactly as the Japanese had hoped. His entire Third Fleet, 9 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers was racing northward to engage what appeared to be the last major Japanese carrier force in the Pacific. What Halsey did not realize was that he was pursuing hollow ships. Ozawa's for carriers the Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda carried fewer than 100 aircraft between them. The veteran Japanese pilots who had once made these ships the terror of the Pacific were long dead, victims of the grinding war of attrition that had consumed Japan's naval aviation. The carriers were little more than elaborate decoys, their primary mission being to draw the American fast carriers away from Leyte Gulf and give Kurita's center force a clear path to the invasion beaches. The Battle of Cape Engano began at dawn on October 25th, with the launch of American strike aircraft from Task Force 38. Commander David McCampbell, already an ace many times over, led the first wave of Hellcats and Avengers toward the Japanese formation. What they found was almost anticlimactic after the desperate struggles occurring simultaneously hundreds of miles to the south. The Japanese carriers put up minimal resistance. Their few remaining aircraft were quickly swept from the sky by the experienced American pilots, and their anti-aircraft defenses were woefully inadequate against the massive American strike force. She rolled over and sank at 9:37 in the morning, taking most of her crew with her. But it was the fate of the Zuikaku that carried the most symbolic weight. This ship had been present at Pearl Harbor, participating in the attack that brought America into the war. She had fought at the Coral Sea, where she helped sink the USS Lexington, and at the Eastern Solomons, where her aircraft had damaged the USS Enterprise. Now, 3 years later, she was paying the price for December 7th, 1941. Wave after wave of American aircraft pounded the veteran carrier. Commander Hugh Winters, flying from the USS Franklin, scored direct hits on her island superstructure, while torpedo bombers from the USS San Jacinto opened her hull to the sea. The Zuikaku fought back with everything she had, her guns firing until the last moment. But the outcome was never in doubt. At 2:14 in the afternoon, Japan's last fleet carrier rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves, taking with her the dreams of naval aviation that had once dominated the Pacific. Admiral Ozawa himself narrowly escaped death when his flagship, the hybrid battleship carrier Eyes, came under concentrated attack. The unique vessel, with her flight deck aft and battleship guns forward, represented Japan's desperate attempt to combine surface firepower with aviation capability. As the day wore on, Halsey began receiving increasingly frantic messages from the South. Admiral Chester William Nimitz himself sent a communication that would become famous in naval history. Where's Task Force 34? The world wonders. The message, intended as a simple inquiry about the location of Halsey's battleships, had been padded with the phrase "the world wonders" for security purposes. But Halsey interpreted it as a personal insult and flew into a rage. More importantly, reports from Taffy 3 were painting a picture of disaster. The small escort carriers were under attack by Japanese battleships, and Admiral Sprague was screaming for help over the radio. Halsey faced the most difficult decision of his career: continue the pursuit of the fleeing Japanese carriers or turn south to help the embattled landing forces. The destruction of Ozawa's force continued throughout the afternoon. The destroyer Akizuki was sunk by cruiser gunfire, while the light cruiser Tama was crippled by torpedo attacks and later finished off by a submarine. By evening, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been sent to the bottom, along with several escorts. The northern force had been virtually annihilated, but at what cost? At 4:20 in the afternoon, Halsey finally made his decision. Leaving the carrier groups to finish off the fleeing Japanese, he turned his battleship south in a desperate race to save the invasion fleet. But by the time Task Force 34 reached the Philippines, the battle off Samar was over, and Kurita's center force was already withdrawing through San Bernardino Strait. The Battle of Cape Engano had been a tactical victory for the Americans, but strategic questions lingered. Had Halsey been right to pursue the carriers, or should he have remained to guard the landing forces? The debate would rage among naval historians for decades. But one thing was certain: Japan's carrier force had been effectively eliminated as a fighting unit, removing the last major threat to American naval supremacy in the Pacific. The morning of October 26, 1944, dawned gray and somber over Leyte Gulf as the true magnitude of the previous 4 days began to emerge from the fog of war. The largest naval battle in human history was finally over, but the constant blood and steel would echo through the ages. From the oil-stained waters off Samar to the wreckage-strewn depths of Surigao Strait, the Philippine Sea had become a vast maritime graveyard. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, received the preliminary casualty reports with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. The strategic objectives had been achieved. Japan's combined fleet had been broken as an effective fighting force, and MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines would proceed without significant naval opposition. But the human cost had been staggering. The USS Princeton, one of America's newest light carriers, lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, victim of a single Japanese dive bomber that had penetrated her combat air patrol. The explosion of her torpedo magazine had killed over 200 men and wounded nearly 400 more. The light cruiser USS Birmingham, attempting to assist the burning carrier, had been devastated when Princeton's after magazine detonated, killing over 200 of Birmingham's crew and wounding nearly 400 in the most catastrophic friendly fire incident of the Pacific War. Off Samar Island, the heroic destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts had fought their last battle. Captain Ernest Edwin Evans went down with his ship, as did most of his crew. The Johnston survivors, floating in shark-infested waters for nearly 2 days, would tell stories of their captain's courage that would become legend in the United States Navy. Commander Robert Witherspoon Copeland of the Samuel B. Roberts, one of the few senior officers to survive the destroyer engagement, would spend the rest of his life honoring the memory of his men who had fought like battleships. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, the only American carrier lost during the battle, had succumbed to the devastating fire of Japanese cruisers after her brave crew had fought to the last shell. Her aircraft, launched with whatever ordnance was available, had continued attacking the Japanese fleet even after their ship was sinking beneath them. The image of Wildcat fighters strafing battleships with machine guns would become one of the most iconic symbols of American determination in the Pacific War. But the Japanese losses dwarfed even these grievous American casualties. The super battleship Musashi, pride of the Imperial Navy and embodiment of Japanese naval engineering, rested on the bottom of the Sabayan Sea along with over half her crew of 2,400 men. Her sister ship Yamato, though surviving the battle, had been damaged and would never again pose a significant threat to Allied operations. In Surigao Strait, the old battleships Fuso and Yamashiro had met their end in the last great gunnery duel of the naval age. Admiral Shoji Nishimura had gone down with his flagship, joining nearly 4,000 Japanese sailors who perished in the third imminent engagement. The Southern force had been completely annihilated, with only the damaged cruiser Mogami escaping temporarily, before being finished off by aircraft the following day. The carrier force that had once dominated the Pacific was no more. The Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and numerous Pacific battles, had finally met her match off Cape Engano. The Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda had joined her on the ocean floor, along with their few remaining aircraft and irreplaceable pilots. Admiral Jisaburo, Ozawa's sacrifice, had achieved its tactical objective, drawing Halsey away from Leyte Gulf, but at the cost of Japan's last offensive naval capability. According to comprehensive battle damage assessments compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Japan had lost for aircraft carriers 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, representing nearly half of the combined fleet's remaining major combatants. More critically, over 10,000 experienced Japanese sailors had perished, including many of the Navy's most skilled officers and petty officers, whose experience could never be replaced. The strategic implications of the Battle of Leyte Gulf extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's merchant marine, already under severe pressure from American submarines, would now be completely cut off from the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the rice paddies of Indochina were now beyond Japan's reach. The home islands would have to continue the war with whatever resources they possessed, and those resources were dwindling rapidly. Perhaps most importantly, the myth of Japanese naval invincibility had been forever shattered. The same fleet that had achieved stunning victories at Pearl Harbor, the Java Sea, and the Indian Ocean had been decisively defeated by an American Navy that had been rebuilt from the ashes of December 7, 1941. The psychological impact on both sides would be profound. American confidence soared, while Japanese morale plummeted. For the men who survived the battle, the memories would last a lifetime. They had participated in the largest naval engagement in human history, a 4-day marathon of courage, sacrifice, and technological warfare that would never be repeated. The age of the battleship was ending. The era of the aircraft carrier was in full swing, and the Pacific War was entering its final, bloody phase. 6 months after the guns fell silent at Leyte Gulf, Emperor Hirohito stood in the ruins of Tokyo, surveying a capital city reduced to ash and rubble by American bombing raids. The great naval battle that had raged across the Philippine Sea in October 1944 had sealed Japan's fate. As surely as if the war had ended that very day, the destruction of the combined fleet had left the home islands defenseless against the growing American armada that now roamed the Pacific at will. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Leyte Gulf rippled outward like the wake of a great ship. With Japanese naval power broken, American forces could strike anywhere along Japan's extended perimeter with impunity. The invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa proceeded without significant naval opposition, though the fanatical resistance encountered on those islands would foreshadow the terrible cost of invading Japan itself. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr., despite criticism for his decision to pursue the Japanese carriers instead of guarding the landing beaches, remained one of America's most celebrated naval commanders. His aggressive tactics and willingness to engage the enemy had contributed significantly to the destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The debate over his actions at Leyte Gulf would continue for decades among military historians, but most would conclude that his overall conduct of the campaign had been brilliant. The heroes of Taffy 3 became legends in American naval history. Captain Ernest Edwin Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the citation reading in part, "Commander Evans' daring and valor in the face of overwhelming enemy odds reflected the highest credit upon himself and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the naval service." The destroyers USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Samuel B. Roberts were commemorated with new ships bearing their names, ensuring that their gallant sacrifice would never be forgotten. The technological lessons learned from Leyte Gulf would reshape naval warfare for generations. The decisive role of aircraft carriers was confirmed beyond any doubt, while the vulnerability of battleships to air attack marked the definitive end of the gunship era. Radar fire control, which had given American forces such a decisive advantage in night fighting, became standard equipment throughout the world's navies. But perhaps the most profound impact of Leyte Gulf was on the men who fought there. Survivors of the battle carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something unique in human history, the largest naval engagement ever fought. involving over 230 vessels and nearly 200,000 men. They had witnessed courage beyond measure and sacrifice beyond calculation. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace, would end the war with 34 confirmed aerial victories, many scored during the Leyte Gulf operations. His aggressive leadership of Fighting Squadron 15 had contributed significantly to the destruction of Japanese naval aviation. Years later, he would reflect that the battle had been the culmination of everything the Navy had learned about carrier warfare since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese survivors faced a different kind of reckoning. Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had commanded the center force, spent the remainder of his life defending his decision to withdraw from Samar. Just as victory seemed within his grasp, his critics argued that he had thrown away Japan's last chance to inflict decisive damage on the American invasion fleet, while his defenders pointed out that his forces were scattered, damaged, and facing what appeared to be overwhelming opposition. The wreckage from the battle would serve as artificial reefs for decades, gradually becoming home to countless species of marine life in ironic transformation from instruments of death to sources of life. The Musashi, located on the bottom of the Sabine Sea in 2015, nearly 71 years after her sinking, revealed the devastating effectiveness of American naval aviation. Her massive hull, broken in half and scattered across the seafloor, bore silent testimony to the fury of that October day in 1944. Modern naval historians consider the Battle of Leyte Gulf to be the decisive engagement of the Pacific War. Even though fighting would continue for another 10 months, the destruction of Japanese naval power made the ultimate defeat of the empire inevitable, though the fanatical resistance that characterized the final campaigns would exact a terrible price from both sides. The battle also marked the emergence of the United States as the world's dominant naval power, a position it would maintain well into the 21st century. The tactical innovations, strategic concepts, and technological advances pioneered during the Leyte Gulf operations would influence naval warfare for generations. Today, the waters off the Philippines appear peaceful and serene, giving no hint of the titanic struggle that once raged there. But beneath the surface lie the bones of great ships and brave men, a permanent memorial to 4 days in October 1944, when the fate of the Pacific was decided by courage, sacrifice, and the terrible arithmetic of war. The Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as the ultimate testament to the decisive power of naval aviation and the enduring spirit of those who go down to the sea in ships, ready to give their lives for the freedom of their nations.